in part because he doesn't, man, I don't know how people live here. Putin himself, because of the concentration, has sharply limited who has access to him simply because there aren't a lot of people to choose from. So he has an inner circle of about 6 people, 3 of whom are absolutely incompetent, like the defense minister, Shoigu, who's one of his old buddies back from East Berlin. Excuse me. In terms of the people that are competent, one of them is the chair of the KGB, FSB, whose name, Patrushev, wow, sorry, it's been a long month, who is providing him with information on internal security, but is of less use on the battlefield. And his chief propagandist is one of the 6 people who's in the inner circle. So imagine if one of your 6 sources of information that you used to manage everything in your life was either Rachel Maddow or Tucker Carlson. He's just not getting information that's great. And it doesn't help that he kind of insists that everybody lie to him about everything. So we get this brittle system that's very top-heavy, but not top-competent. And in that sort of environment, in dynamic situations like, I don't know, a war, you are flirting with state collapse. On the security front, now the Russians launched their assault in Ukraine not because they were mad, or because Putin has an ego, or wants to rebuild an empire. No. The Russian demographic is in collapse. The Russian ethnicity is going to cease to exist this century. It's just a question of how long the state can hold on. Ukraine is on the way to 2 of the big invasion access points into the Russian space. And with a demographic that's in collapse, Putin rightly feels that unless they can control those gateways, the next time there's a major war, the Russian system will dissolve. Because there won't be anyone to defend it, so you have to concentrate forces in the access points to make a block. That's what this is all about. This is what it's always been about. That strategic desperation is why this war is happening. But the only thing that would be worse from the Russian point of view of not launching it, and probably seeing the Russian system disintegrate between 2040 and 2070, would be to launch it and fail. Because that would leave Russia completely open to all those invasion avenues. At the same time, it has paid all the costs for the war. At the same time, it is now under a degree of sanction from pretty much everyone as long as this government is in power. So we are looking, if the Russians lose this war, at a complete disintegration of the system on the time frame of like 10 years. Remember, with the recent mobilization, we're pulling about 500,000 Russian men in their 20s out and throwing them into the meat grinder. They might be able to make a difference. You throw 500,000 men at anything, it's going to make a difference. But it's going to come at the cost of the depletion of the last generation that the Russians have to even generate kids in the first place. There are less than 8 million Russian men in their 20s, and we're now looking at about 10% of them being involved directly in the war. This isn't going to be the last mobilization either, because the Russians don't have the tech. All they have are bodies. And in half of the wars that Russia has been in, where they've won on numbers. But this time around, those numbers are all they have, and when they're gone, they're depleted and they're never coming back. There is no next generation. So Putin, like Xi, is likely to preside over the end of his country. All right, that's it for me. Next time, we're talking about the Saudis. Mohammed bin Salman. Woohoo! Take care. Hey everyone, Peter Zeihan here, coming to you from the Reflecting Pool in DC, which is up opposite the Jefferson Memorial, which is probably my favorite of the memorials, and Jefferson my favorite president. So I thought it would be a good drawback to talk about perhaps the world's most un-Jeffersonian leader and one of my least favorite people, Mohammed bin Salman, the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia. Now, Mohammed bin Salman is, what's the best way to put this? He's the quintessential millennial. He's entitled. He gets very disappointed and a little pouty when he doesn't get his way. But he also is very good at managing people. And that means that even though he's every bit as much of a dictatorship as Xi Jinping in China or Vladimir Putin in Russia, he's much more successful. He's able to actually run people effectively, have conversations with them, manage some of the details, and the job that he has to do is a lot easier than either of those two mega states. Saudi Arabia has a mid-sized population. You're really only talking a little more than 30 million people, and it's a one-horse show when it comes to the economy. It's really just oil. And especially if you're bringing in people to work the oil fields for you, you get to decide policy and foreign policy and strategic policy and general direction, but the details are handled by competent people. So a dictatorship can work in a place like Saudi Arabia, where it'd be far more difficult in a place like China or Russia. So a little bit of background about how he got there. Over a century ago, the tribe of Saud, which ultimately MBS is descended from, cut a series of deals with the merchants who controlled the cities on the west coast. Now, at the time, we're talking pre-industrial here, so the tribe of Saud was basically a bunch of desert raiders, whereas the folks on the coast saw themselves as more sophisticated, and that's pretty much accurate. And the deal that was cut was that social policy and political policy would be set by the tribe, whereas the folks on the coast would handle all the trade and all the economics. It was a good deal for both, and to be perfectly blunt, the folks on the coast got the better part of the deal. But then after the 1920s, oil was found in the interior, and all of a sudden the tribes had more money than they knew what to do with, and they took over, completely isolated the coast, and in essence, the tribe of Saud became the House of Saud. So you've got these people descended from desert raiders who were hyper violent, who all of a sudden had more money than God and could impose whatever whim they had upon the world. For a long time, the leadership of Saudi Arabia were a series of kings, princes, elevated to king, called the Sudari Seven. 7 brothers, all born from the same wife of the initial king of Saudi Arabia. But they ruled until they died, and they were all more or less the same age, and so they were getting older and older and older and more decrepit. So it became very clear in Saudi Arabia that they needed to skip a generation, and they eventually settled on Mohammed bin Salman as the crown prince, and he's basically the king now. Now, he is a millennial, he is young, which means assuming he's not assassinated, always a risk. He is likely to be the king of Saudi Arabia for the next 50 years. So Saudi Arabia has something that the Russians and the Chinese will never have: continuity of government while controlling a resource that no one can do without, because it's not an issue of relocating the manufacturing base. You either have the oil or you don't. So this is a country that is long for this world, and as such, the ambitions of Mohammed bin Salman and the goals of Saudi Arabia are not simply fused, they matter on a global scale. And by far the country that has the most to be concerned about because of this is Iran, who the Saudis have always seen as their primary rival. Now, the Iranians, for their part, have a culture that stretches back over 1,000 years. They say over 3,000, and it's not a ridiculous claim. Now, the Iranians have all kinds of problems, but I think their biggest one is that cultural history gives them a degree of arrogance, and so they just look down on the Arabs. But then here you have Saudi Arabia with a significantly larger economy, who has better relations with the United States, with Japan, with China, with the United Kingdom, with France, with Turkey, with all of the world's powers, because ultimately the Saudis have something that they all need. Which means, in a post-American Middle East, the question isn't, will the Saudis try to take out the Iranians? It's how many allies will they be able to rally to do it for them? And as we get into a bigger and bigger energy crisis globally, MBS's goal of completely destroying the Iranian state all of a sudden looks a lot more